There is a hole right in the middle of my vegetable bed. Inside that hole sits a pipe. It is just a plain white PVC pipe sticking about 4 inches out of the ground with a cheap plastic lid sitting on top. My neighbors are convinced I have lost my mind. My gardening friends eventually stopped asking questions after a while. But here is what none of them actually know. That ugly, unremarkable pipe is quietly producing the most expensive fertilizer on earth every single day, completely for free, directly at the roots of my plants without me lifting a single finger. No turning compost piles, no hauling heavy bags of fertilizer from the store, no spreaders, no measuring, and no schedule. It is just a pipe in the ground in a system so old, so elegant, and so brutally efficient that the modern fertilizer industry has spent decades making sure you never heard about it. See, most people think composting requires sacrifice. You sacrifice space for a big bin in the corner of your yard. You sacrifice your nose every time you open the lid. You sacrifice your Saturday morning turning, mixing, and waiting. And then, after all of that, you still have to shovel it out and carry it back to where your plants actually are. What if the entire system was broken by design? What if someone figured out a way to let the earth do every single step invisibly underground on its own timeline? That is exactly what this pipe does. And once I show you the science behind why it works, you will never look at a bag of fertilizer the same way again. This is not a new idea. It is actually one of the oldest agricultural secrets on the planet, and it was buried quite deliberately sometime around the middle of the 20th century. The Aztecs knew it. Long before synthetic fertilizer existed, civilizations across Mesoamerica understood that earthworms were the invisible engine beneath their soil. They did not disturb them. They did not relocate them. They built their growing systems around them, letting organic waste decompose in place underground, so the worms could do what worms have always done. Then in the 1880s, a quiet, obsessive English scientist spent the last 40 years of his life studying earthworms. His name was Charles Darwin, and most people remember him for evolution. But Darwin himself considered his final book, a dense, detailed study of earthworm behavior and soil transformation, to be one of the most important works of his career. He proved scientifically that earthworms are the primary architects of fertile soil. Not rain, not sunlight, but worms. That knowledge did not disappear, it was crowded out. After World War II, the same chemical plants that had been manufacturing explosives needed a new market. They pivoted to nitrogen fertilizer, and almost overnight, the entire agricultural conversation shifted from soil biology to soil chemistry. From working with living systems to replacing them with synthetic ones, the industry needed farmers, and eventually home gardeners, to believe that fertility came from a bag, not from the ground. So the worm got forgotten. Not because the science was wrong, but because the science was inconvenient for people who needed to sell you something every single season. What Darwin proved and what the industry ignored is exactly why that pipe in my garden works. And the mechanism behind it is stranger and more precise than most people expect. Here is where it gets interesting. Earthworms do not have eyes. They do not have ears. But they have something far more useful for what we are trying to do, which is an extraordinary sensitive chemical detection system built into every single centimeter of their skin. They sense the world almost entirely through moisture and chemical gradients in the soil. And one of the signals they are most powerfully drawn to is the smell of decomposing organic matter. When you drop a banana peel or a handful of coffee grounds into that PVC pipe and seal the lid, the decomposition process begins almost immediately. Microbes break down the material, releasing specific volatile compounds into the surrounding soil through every hole you drilled into the pipe. Those compounds diffuse outward through the moisture in the soil like a slow, invisible broadcast signal, and every earthworm within range receives that signal and begins moving toward it. This is not random wandering. Research in soil biology has shown that earthworms navigate toward food sources with surprising directional accuracy, following chemical gradients through the soil, the way a shark follows a scent trail through water. The pipe becomes an anchor point, a permanent feeding station that pulls worms in from a radius that can extend well beyond the edges of your planting bed. They enter through the drilled holes, feed inside the chamber, and then do something critical. They leave. They move back out through those same holes and travel through your entire root zone, digesting organic material as they go, aerating the soil with every tunnel they create, and depositing their waste, which scientists call castings, in a continuous trail directly through the area where your plant roots are actively growing. That is the elegance of the system. The pipe does not contain the fertility. It generates a gravitational pull that distributes fertility across your entire bed through the natural movement of the worms themselves. You are not building a compost bin. You are building a worm highway with a permanent rest stop in the middle. And what those worms are leaving behind in your soil is something no fertilizer company wants you to price out for yourself. Let us price it out right now. Worm castings, the technical term for worm waste, sell for anywhere between $15 and $30 for a small 5-liter bag at most garden centers. If you have ever bought a bag and read the label, you already know it is marketed as premium, almost luxury fertilizer. But the price tag only tells half the story. The real question is why it commands that price, and the answer is something synthetic fertilizer fundamentally cannot replicate. Standard chemical fertilizers are built around 3 numbers you see on every bag: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK ratio. They deliver those elements in a soluble, fast-release form that floods the soil, gives the plant a short burst of growth, and then leaches away with the next rainfall. The plant gets a spike, then it needs another hit. It is, by design, a dependency cycle. Worm castings work on an entirely different principle. The nutrients inside castings are bound within a slow-release biological matrix, meaning they become available to plant roots gradually in response to the plant's own uptake signals, rather than all at once. But beyond NPK, castings contain something no synthetic fertilizer has ever successfully bottled. They are dense with beneficial microbial life, including bacteria and fungi that form direct symbiotic relationships with plant root systems. They contain naturally occurring plant growth hormones, specifically auxins and cytokinins, that signal plants to accelerate root development and increase stress resistance. They contain humic acids that physically improve soil structure, helping sandy soils retain moisture and compacted soils breathe. A 2011 study published in the journal Applied Soil Ecology found that even small concentrations of worm castings mixed into growing media significantly outperform synthetic fertilizer in both germination rates and early plant growth. The mechanism is not just nutrition, it is biological communication between the casting microbiome and the plant root system. And your pipe is generating this exact material right now at no cost, deposited directly into the zone where your roots are hungriest. The factory is already running underground. You just have not plugged it in yet. Now let us build it. The materials are almost insultingly simple, which is part of why this system gets dismissed by people who have been conditioned to believe that effective gardening requires expensive equipment. You need one length of PVC pipe, ideally between 4 and 6 inches in diameter, or alternatively, a plastic bucket with a lid, the kind you can find at any hardware store for a few dollars. The diameter matters because you want enough interior volume to hold a meaningful amount of organic waste without needing to feed it every single day, but not so large that the decomposition rate inside slows down from insufficient microbial density. For depth, you are aiming to bury the pipe so that roughly 2/3 of its total length sits below the soil surface with about 4 inches remaining above ground as your loading port. In practical terms, for most home garden beds, a pipe or bucket between 18 and 24 inches long works well. That puts the bottom of your chamber at a depth where soil moisture is more consistent and worm activity is highest, typically between 10 and 16 inches down, depending on your climate. Before you bury it, drill your holes. Use a standard drill with a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch bit and cover the entire lower 2/3 of the pipe with holes, spacing them roughly 2 to 3 inches apart in a scattered pattern all the way around the circumference. You are not building a filter, you are building a door system, and you want as many entry and exit points as possible so worms can move freely in every direction. The more holes, the more traffic. The more traffic, the wider the distribution of castings through your bed. For the bottom of the pipe, you have 2 options. You can leave it completely open, which allows worms to enter from directly below, and also lets liquid from decomposing material drain naturally into the surrounding soil, carrying soluble nutrients with it. Or you can cap it loosely with a piece of mesh or landscape fabric to prevent larger debris from clogging the base while still allowing worm passage. Both approaches work. The open bottom is simpler and slightly more effective for worm movement. Position the pipe as close to the center of your planting bed as your layout allows. The goal is to maximize the radius of influence so that worms traveling outward from the feeding chamber pass through the root zones of as many plants as possible before they stop and deposit castings. Once it is in the ground and your lid is on top, the infrastructure is complete. But how you feed it determines everything about how well it performs. Feeding the pipe is where most people either get this right immediately or develop small habits that quietly undermine the whole system. The rule is simpler than you think, but the reasoning behind it matters enough to explain properly. Almost any raw kitchen waste goes in. Fruit and vegetable scraps, banana peels, apple cores, wilted salad greens, coffee grounds, used tea bags without the staple, crushed eggshells, cooked plain rice or pasta in small amounts, and torn up cardboard or newspaper to balance moisture. These are the inputs that decompose at a rate worms can track and respond to, releasing those chemical signals through the soil consistently enough to keep your worm population anchored near the pipe. What you do not put in is equally important. Meat, fish, and dairy decompose through a different bacterial pathway that produces ammonia-based compounds in concentrations that are actually repellent to earthworms rather than attractive. Cooked food with oils, sauces, or heavy seasoning falls into the same category. Citrus peels in large quantities create an acidity that disrupts the microbial balance inside the chamber. And anything treated with pesticides or herbicides, including some commercially grown produce scraps, can introduce chemical residues that harm the very worm population you are trying to cultivate. Keep the inputs clean, raw, and plant-based, and the system regulates itself. Feeding frequency is flexible. Every 2 to 3 days is ideal for maintaining consistent decomposition activity, but the system tolerates gaps of a week or more without collapsing. Worms that leave the chamber during a quiet period will return when activity resumes. The pipe is a permanent feature of your bed, not a machine that breaks down if you miss a cycle. You will know the system is working when you start seeing worm castings accumulating visibly inside the chamber after several weeks. When the soil immediately surrounding the pipe becomes noticeably darker and more crumbly than the rest of the bed. And when your plants closest to the pipe begin outpacing everything else in the garden in ways that become difficult to explain to anyone who has not seen this before. The most common mistake is overloading the pipe faster than the microbial population inside can process the material. If you open the lid and smell something aggressively unpleasant, rather than the earthy, fungal smell of healthy decomposition, slow down your inputs and add a handful of dry cardboard or dried leaves to rebalance the carbon to nitrogen ratio inside the chamber. Everything this system produces, it produces silently underground without asking anything of you except the scraps you were already throwing away. And that is exactly the kind of knowledge that certain industries have always preferred you never stumble across. If you made it this far, you now know something that most people who have been gardening for decades still do not know. Not because it is complicated, not because it requires special skills or expensive tools, but because a system that turns your kitchen scraps into the most potent fertilizer on Earth for free forever, using nothing but biology that has existed for 500 million years, is genuinely terrible for the business model of every company that sells you something to grow your food. That is the real reason this knowledge stays quiet, not conspiracy, just economics. So when you share this video, understand that you are not doing me a favor. You are doing something slightly subversive. You are putting information in front of someone who has probably been buying bags of fertilizer every season for years without ever questioning whether they needed to. Every person who watches this and builds one of these pipes is one fewer customer in that cycle. If that feels like something worth being part of, hit subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because every video on this channel is built around the same premise, that the most powerful tools for growing your own food have already been discovered, are almost always free, and are almost never the thing being advertised to you. And in the next video, I'm going to show you something that makes this pipe look like a warm-up. A technique for rebuilding completely dead, compacted, lifeless soil in under 60 days using nothing but materials most people throw away. No tilling, no amendments from a store, just biology working the way it was always supposed to. That one you do not want to miss. If this revelation about the hidden power of earthworms has changed how you view your garden, please subscribe and like the video. We are uncovering the agricultural history and biological secrets that the industry tried to bury. Let's cultivate a more self-sufficient future together. The next breakthrough in your garden's potential will be revealed very soon.